Alright guys, welcome back to Underground Science, and in this video, we'll be covering the basic overview of a simple reflex arc. Alright, so let's go and get started. So the first things first, right? Reflex doesn't involve actually the higher order thinking of our brain parts, right? So the cerebral cortex doesn't involve the cerebral cortex, right? So it doesn't involve the cerebral cortex. And so let me go and write this down and we'll talk about it more. So it does involve the cerebral cortex. And it's so cool because you would think like everything needs to be involved with the brain, right? But a reflex is so necessary. Some examples that you'll see, like even if you think of the hot stove example, like if you touch a hot stove, it doesn't communicate, your nerves don't immediately communicate with your brain because at first your main job of your body is to pull your hand out, right, of the hot stove, like pull it out, pull in the opposite direction so you don't injure yourself, you don't injure your skin cells or burn yourself, right? So there's just cool examples like that, and we'll go over another video of another example of a reflex arc where if you go for like a simple physical checkup or something at the doctor's office, like how they hit your patellar tendon, and we'll see why and how this reflex arc works when you have a sudden jerk movement of your quadriceps muscles flexing, right? So we'll see that later, but so let's just go over the basic overview of a simple reflex arc. All right, so let's go and get started. So the first thing that's involved is you have to have some afferent neuron. Okay, and what an afferent neuron is, so let me go and write this down. So an afferent neuron is referred to as a sensory neuron. All right, so an afferent neuron is referred to a sensory neuron. And you'll see these neurons also drawn out sometimes as a pseudo-unipolar neuron, which means that its soma actually it's not in the gray matter of the spinal cord, unlike the efferent neuron. Right, so I'm getting ahead of myself, so let's go and write down what an efferent neuron is. Alright, so an efferent neuron, guys, is a motor neuron. Alright, so it's referred to, let me go and erase this, it's referred to a motor neuron. Alright, so let's go and write that down. So again, an afferent neuron is referred to a sensory neuron, and an efferent neuron is referred to a motor neuron. Alright, so one thing to make sure here that we have a drawing again. If you guys have been watching my previous nervous system videos, we've seen this sketch already, like my trying to improve my artistic ability sketch. Alright, so we see the spinal cord cutout right here. We see the gray matter, right? All along here, this is the gray matter of the spinal cord, or also called the unmyelinated part of the spinal cord. Right, so all of this is the gray matter, and then we have our white matter over here, right? Our anterior white columns, lateral white columns, dorsal white columns, right, and so on for our gray matter. And then in here, though, let's go and actually draw it right here. So we have our neuron, our afferent neuron, that actually comes in, and so what it does, right, it pretty much takes the signals, brings those signals into the gray matter of the spinal cord, if we're talking about a spinal cord reflex. Remember, we have the brainstem also. There's reflexes for the brainstem also, right? Related to many things like facial reflexes, facial muscle reflexes, or coughing or vomiting or gag reflexes, and many other really important reflexes. But if we're just focusing on the spinal cord for this part, then what's going to happen is we're going to have a synapse, or we're going to synapse in the spinal cord from our afferent neuron. So let's go and draw this. So let's say we have, let's say our finger muscles is right here, and we have some dendrites in a nerve cell that's near our finger muscles, or just sensory receptors, right? Let's go and draw it like these. We have little dendrites, right, receiving the signals. Let's say you touch something painful and you need to pull back really fast, okay, or else you're going to injure yourself. We have a bunch of dendrites there. Those pain signals will then send its graded potentials down into the dendrites, which will actually trigger an action potential, right? And notice I'm not drawing the soma right now because the soma is not there in that specific spot. The axons is actually going to go and project down all the way to the gray matter of the spinal cord. Now, where's the soma? Well, remember I said it's generally a pseudo-unipolar neuron. When we're talking about afferent neurons, it's generally, I can't speak, a pseudo-unipolar neuron. So what that means is that the soma is going to be actually like about right here. It's near the dorsal root ganglion area actually. So it's not near the dendrites, or it's not in the gray matter unlike the efferent neuron. So this is our soma, all right, of our afferent neuron. And so what happens is that another thing that we have to keep in mind is that our afferent neuron takes the signals and synapses near the dorsal part of the gray matter of the spinal cord, which means it synapses on the posterior part of the spinal cord. All right, so it receives information, brings it in towards the posterior part of the spinal cord in the gray matter, and then we have interneurons here. Interneurons are pretty much just neurons that connect two other neurons together. So in this case, this interneuron here, right, that I'm just going to draw like this, is connecting, right, this small interneuron right here is connecting our afferent neuron to our efferent neuron. So connecting, and most of your central nervous system neurons are interneurons, right? So connecting afferent neuron to efferent neuron, or your efferent neuron, which is your motor neuron. All right, and we'll see how. So this interneuron will then connect to this motor neuron right here, and this is still in the gray matter, guys, all right? This is still in the gray matter of the spinal cord. It's going to connect here, and this time we're going to have the soma, or the cell body of the motor neuron. It's going to be present inside the gray matter. All right, so this is still the gray matter. I know it looks like it's outside, but we're going to count this still in the gray matter. So here I'll draw it like this. So it'll help us visualize it better. So this part is still in the gray matter. All right, so this is still, we're indicating that it's in the gray matter still, okay? The picture's a little too small though. But what's going to happen, right? So our signals are going to be picked up from this, afferent neuron. Then this afferent neuron is going to travel down, take those action potentials, drop it off in the posterior part of the gray matter of the spinal cord. So drop those signals off. The interneuron is going to pick it up. Then the interneuron is going to drop those graded potentials, those electric signals off to the motor neuron, or the efferent neuron. Now the efferent neuron, also called the motor neuron, is then going to synapse. It's going to travel down an axon. We're going to have action potentials traveling down an axon, and we're going to tell that muscle pretty much, like, let's say, to contract, so we can move our hand back or something if we touch like a pointy object. All right, so you could see that this reflex arc didn't really involve our cerebrum, right, or our cerebral cortex in particular. Okay, so that's what happens. So this is our simple reflex arc. So let me go and draw, like, let's say we're telling our muscle, right, our finger muscles or something, to pull back really fast. Okay, so if we're touch some sharp object or something. So this is our muscle, and it's striated, right, and we release our neurotransmitters, most likely acetylcholine, and then we're gonna pull back our hand, right, our fingers. Okay, so that's a simple reflex arc. We have signals that get picked up by our afferent sensory neuron, right? It's a sensory neuron, so it senses the signals. It senses the either if it's pain, or if it's any like cold touch or hot touch, any of those signals picks up by these dendrites, right? Remember, these structures are called dendrites. And so I'm going to write this down. So it's going to pick these signals up. If the graded potentials are big enough, if the temporal summation and the spatial summation equals the threshold potential, then we're going to have action potentials fired down this axon, and we're going to have our soma, remember, in our dorsal root ganglion area, which is near the posterior part of the spinal cord. And then those action potentials are going to come and trigger these vesicles at the end of the synapse to release the neurotransmitters to this interneuron in the gray matter of the spinal cord, so in the central nervous system. This interneuron is going to pick these signals up, respond to these neurotransmitters that was released by the sensory neuron. It's going to pick those signals up, drop those signals off, causing this motor neuron to fire action potentials down its axon, going back to that muscle, let's say we had sensory receptors here, right? That picked up the signals of your fingers getting hurt or something, right? Touching something hot, too cold, too pointy, too sharp. This is going to trigger neurotransmitters released into these dendrites, and then that's going to start from there. But when the motor neuron comes back, it's going to come back to that, let's say that finger area, and you're going to pull back, all right? So it's a reflex. And one other thing to mention before we end the video is that the motor neuron leaves from the anterior part of the spinal cord. So let's go and write both of those down. So we said that the afferent neuron synapses in the dorsal part of the gray matter of the spinal cord, right? Dorsal is the same thing as posterior. So I'm just going to write that down. Dorsal is the same thing as the posterior part and of the spinal cord. And then we said that efferent neurons, or the efferent neuron, the motor neuron, is going to leave, or is going to exit, will exit via the anterior part of the spinal cord. All right, remember one other difference between the motor neuron and the sensory neuron, and when the terms of talking about, if we're talking about a simple reflex arc, is that the afferent neuron, notice, has its soma or cell body outside of the gray matter of the spinal cord, outside the spinal cord in general. However, the efferent neuron that leaves the central nervous system gray matter, right? We even highlighted it here that from here to here, the dendrites and the soma of the motor neuron is still in the gray matter of the spinal cord. I just couldn't show it properly because we ran out of room. But make sure to pay attention to that detail. Is that, let's go ahead and even write that down. So that for the efferent neuron, it's still in the gray matter of the spinal cord. All right, especially in the anterior part of the spinal cord. Because remember, our motor neurons leave from the ventral part of the spinal cord. And ventral pretty much just means anterior, so I'm going to write that down. Ventral means anterior. All right, so let me go and finish this sentence. So it's still in the gray matter, right? So the soma and the cell body and the dendrites of a efferent neuron involved in a simple reflex arc is going to be inside the gray matter of the spinal cord. So is the interneuron, all right? But that's an exception. We talk about afferent neuron because the sensory neuron's soma or cell body is in the dorsal root ganglion place, or also in the posterior part of the spinal cord place, all right? Or near the posterior part of the spinal cord. So it's near the dorsal root ganglion, all right? And that's pretty much it. That's the basic idea of a simple reflex arc. And maybe in a future video, we'll look at how one of those reflex tests in the physical exam, in your physical exam at the doctor's office, how that works, like physiologically. All right, so that also involves a reflex arc. And so if we got this video down, that video shouldn't be that hard. All right. So hopefully this video made sense to you guys. Hopefully in my future videos, you guys tune into my future videos is what I meant to say, and I'll be making more cool topics about biochem, physics, and chem. So I really hope to see you guys there. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you know when I'm publishing my future videos. And see you guys, and stay safe.